I was in Venezuela the last 2 years, starting in 2008. I moved down there to work with Global Exchange and direct their program down there where we were organizing delegations. We still do that. So I was directing that program for a year. And that's basically how, before that I was actually already doing work around Venezuela with Global Exchange in San Francisco as well. But it was in that time basically that I got to really get started with the idea and the kind of formation around this book, and really developing a lot of the context and some of the people that ended up actually being in the book in the end.
Okay. And then could you tell us about the book, what it consists of?
So Venezuela Speaks is a collection of interviews with people from across the spectrum of Venezuelan social movements. The idea basically was simply to move beyond, the Chavez-centric kind of focus of Venezuela, and to really redefine the discourse about what's happening there to a certain extent, so that when we think about the Bolivarian Revolution, we don't simply think about Chavez or statements or government policies, which of course form the foundation of all of that. But what we wanted to show is that that there's this process there that is encapsulated in this idea of participatory democracy, and a part of that participatory democracy we feel is being exemplified most strongly through these social movements. This was a really amazing example of showing how these organized communities are responding to the government. These organizations, these movements that have, many of them existed before Chavez came into power, and what that dynamic has been like, which we feel like there was not nearly enough attention being paid to that, and we feel like that really distorted people's vision of what was going on there.
Could you give us a few examples of people you interview and organizations that you spotlight?
Yeah, we tried to be as broad as possible, with what is happening in Venezuela, right? So it's everything from, the women's movement to the Afro-Venezuelan movement to the indigenous movement, labor movement, cooperatives, communal councils, occupied factories. And we had one or two kind of interviews, to basically focus on those particular movements. Also the student movement and the community media movement were a big part of that as well.
Great. How would you define the Bolivarian Revolution?
I would define it, and this goes back to kind of what we wanted it to do in terms of this book, is I would define it as a movement consisting of various social movements. And what that means is that there's that there is this larger political process, and there's various words or themes that get used to describe it. Of a lot of people talk about the refounding of the republic, which is the platform that Chavez originally based his political party on, that he won the elections with for the first time in 1998, the movement for a Fifth Republic, and that became the foundation of what is currently being talked about in Venezuela. This idea of refounding the republic, of developing a participatory democracy, and now what people are talking about in strongly within the government as well is the idea of popular power. So all those things are, I would say, key ideas in terms of what makes up the Bolivarian Revolution.
Okay. We hear about the Venezuela and the Venezuelan Revolution are constantly being demonized in the media and by U.S. politicians, and I'm wondering what it is about the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela that you think the United States is most scared of.
Well, there's a lot of things there I think that the United States is scared of, right? And then, people talk about these various things. Obviously, one is simply to have an anti-imperialist government and leader, which does actually speak out at international forums and on the international stage, that is coalescing a group of other essentially anti-imperialist leaders in Latin America to form an alternative bloc, an alternative political bloc, an alternative economic project for Latin America. And obviously that is incredibly threatening in terms of just transforming the dominant discourse about Latin America and the United States, and what that relationship has been historically and what that should be in the future. And also I mean, the kind of integration that's being talked about, by these leaders, which is very different kind of integration, the idea of regional integration as opposed to free trade based, kind of integration. And that was, I think, needs to be constantly reminded to people that, Chavez himself, I mean, that he played an incredible role as a political leader in defeating and having a major role in defeating the free trade area of the Americas. Had Chavez, had Lula, had these leaders, not come into, power at those times, we would likely have something like the free trade area of the Americas right now, which, was basically the expansion of, a NAFTA style, North American Free Trade Agreement style economic agreement to the rest of the Americas. So you can say what you will about these leaders and, whether or not we agree with everything that they do, but it's very clear that historically, politically, they played an incredible role on that stage. So there's that, and there's also, of course, the threat of a good example. And what that means, I guess, is, the idea that, again, that there's an alternative idea being created about democracy, about the way we should be running our society. Again, moving away from this anti-neoliberal ideology, moving from, focus on, a state that is privatizing industries, is diminishing barriers to transnational capital to coming into these countries, to actually a state that is moving away from, not just moving away from privatization, but actually moving towards, nationalization, which we've seen to a certain extent, but also just a government state commitment to social programs, to an investment in education and health that sees those things as being a fundamental human right, as opposed to simply something that's being placed on the market. And so that obviously clashes strongly, I think, with the dominant ideas of neoliberal ideology, right, which is what has been getting promoted by the U.S. and, the international financial institutions over the last, half century at least.
Mm-hmm. And often in the media, Venezuela is portrayed as a totalitarian state, or extremely repressive, anti-democratic state. How do you think the reality in Venezuela conflicts or does not conflict with that?
I think that's a really great question, because in so many ways I think that those of us that have been learning or have been communicating about the Bolivarian Revolution have been forced into a situation where we constantly have to respond to, I think, conservative distortion in media around, that exact thing, where we're being forced to respond into this idea that we have to defend this idea that, like, in other words, that we fall into that trap, right, of having to say, well, of course it's not that, which we know it's not that. For us, the best way of actually showing that Venezuela is so far from that is to actually give voice to these social movements that, again, many of these have been around before Chavez, to show that show what their experiences have been like under the last decade of Chavez, right? And in fact, basically what you see, and just about everybody talks about, is that there's been an incredible opening up of political opportunities for people in a way that they had never had before. And that, again, relates to moving from this idea of representative democracy to participatory democracy. And that's not this clean process either. And the point of our book was to show that basically the best way of showing what participatory democracy looks like is showing that there are these autonomous institutions, these independent organizations that are mobilizing, that are challenging the government that they actually support when it's necessary. So it is there's that tension that exists, right? Because they support a government that's opened up political opportunities for them, but they also, of course, like any community or organization that's pushing for their own demands, recognize that when it's necessary, they have to push on that same government in order to achieve what they really want. And that, of course, relates to a whole political process that gets talked about in Venezuela, where there's discussion around the bureaucracy a lot, how, although Chavez might be with the political process, that these social movements are supporting, that oftentimes there's a bureaucracy that's blocking further, transformation. But in terms of that idea that there's a lack of democracy, I mean, one solid example of that is the way that the discourse around media in Venezuela, and how right-wing conservative media has we've allowed them to frame the issue of media in Venezuela, responding to them about how, you know, the non-renewal of the RCTV license is you know, well, we know that's all flawed and false in the way that that's been framed and talked about. But what doesn't get talked about enough, I think, in order to respond to that, is to show that, in fact, not only, you know, was that particular situation distorted in the media of the non-renewal, I mean, of, you know, the non-renewal, which they called a closing down of a private television station, which they said was simply for political reasons, when in fact it was basically responding to the fact that this was a private television station that was evidently involved with the attempted overthrow of Chavez. But beyond just saying that and responding in that way, what hasn't been talked about enough is that there's this amazing community media movement in Venezuela, which has allowed the flourishing of hundreds of community radio stations,